Thank you for joining Humanitarian Congress Tokyo 2024. Now we would like to start the session 4, which is entitled Climate Change and Humanitarian Crisis, Navigating the Future Together. My name is Masashi Tsudaka, and I'm a Senior Program Coordinator in the Institute for Global Environmental Strategies, in short, IGES, which is an international environmental sustainability think tank based in Japan. I'm very much honored to play a role of moderator for this occasion. Before everything, I'd like to welcome distinguished guest speakers for this session, participating from different parts of the world. Let me first introduce Ms. Catherine Loon Grayson from the ICRC, International Committee of the Red Cross. She is head of policy in the Department of International Law, Policy, and Humanitarian Diplomacy in the ICRC. Thank you for joining us today. Next, I would like to introduce Mr. Bradley Mellicker from IOM, International Organization for Migration. He is working as a senior regional emergency and post-crisis specialist in the IOM. Welcome. And next is Ms. Maria Guevara from MSF, Médecins Sans Frontières, or Doctors Without Borders. She is International Medical Secretary of MSF. Thank you for joining us. Last but not least, we would like to welcome Ms. Ririko Noda. She is a member of a youth group called Japan Youth Platform for Sustainability, JYPS in short. Thank you for your participation. With these distinguished guests, this session aims to illuminate the various impacts of climate change on humanitarian crises from multiple perspectives. After my small introduction on the topic, the guest speakers will talk about the challenges confronted by their organizations in the face of these impacts, and explore approaches and strategies for humanitarian organizations to effectively address the impact of climate change on crisis response and adaptation. And of course, we will hear from Ms. Ririko about youth perspectives on these issues as well. Now, I'd like to start my little introduction. It has been widely argued that climate change is exacerbating already severe humanitarian crises, and many scientific literatures, such as IPCC reports, are backing up a vision that it would become increasingly difficult for humans to survive or adapt to climate change if we fail to mitigate the impact of climate change. Although now I belong to a research institute, I used to be a humanitarian worker myself, providing protection and assistances to the people affected by the conflict in Palestine, the Philippines, Afghanistan, South Sudan, and Myanmar. While I worked in the field, I was running around to fill humanitarian needs here and there, non-stop, doing whatever I could do to alleviate the suffering of the people, without having a deep knowledge of a bigger picture. And what I mean by bigger picture here is a planetary issue, for example, climate change, among others. What if Afghanistan did not face drought that year? Would the conflict have been less intense? What if that part of South Sudan did not have flood? Would the forced migration have been smaller scale? Once you're in a humanitarian mission on the ground, you have almost no space in your mind to think about those questions, because you are there to save people in front of you. However, those questions are still worth keeping in your mind, because there might be a better solution to minimize the people's suffering than only providing lifeline supports. We can estimate, anticipate, and prepare for the impact of climate change for the communities to be resilient to various shocks. The world leaders started to describe the current situation in a different way. For example, not climate change, but a climate crisis instead. Not global warming anymore, but global boiling. It is alarming, and we feel that climate change is getting nearer or overlapped with humanitarian issues, such as food security, displacement, and health. Recently, due to an increased demand in knowledge about climate and security nexus, my institute, IGES, has newly launched a project called the Asia Pacific Climate Security Project. And I am now participating in this initiative as a researcher. This itself shows that climate change is now a common threat to our security, including food security, energy security, and other bases of our livelihood, which research community as well as humanitarian community need to tackle. Given such a background, I'd like to hear from the frontrunners of the humanitarian sector who we invited today. I'm sure that the voice from the field is always invaluable and enlightening for us. Ms. Catherine Loon, please take the floor and introduce yourself and your organization, and what kind of challenges your agency is facing right now, and how to better address those challenges. Floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Masashi. And thank you for inviting me to join this conversation. So I work for the ICRC. For those who are not familiar with the ICRC is an organization that works with communities that are enduring conflict or violence to alleviate their suffering. We started, I'd say fairly recently, but for obvious reasons, to pay greater attention to the impacts of a changing climate and a changing environment on the communities we work with, and what are the implications for our humanitarian response. What I'd like to do in the next few minutes is present some of the findings that are captured in a report that we published just ahead of COP28 that's called Weathering the Storm, that focuses both on the problem, but turns more to what are effective approaches to strengthen people's resilience to growing climate risks and conflict settings. And that's based on our experience in the Gaza Strip, in northern Mozambique, and in eastern Niger. I will first very briefly describe what the problem is. So what is it that we're looking at? Countries that are enduring conflict or violence are particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate and the environmental crisis because of the very impact of conflicts on societies. Conflicts destroy the foundations of societies, and they radically reduce their capacity to cope with any type of shocks, because they affect social cohesion, they affect the economy, they destroy infrastructure, basic services, and so on. If we can go to the next slide, yes, thank you. You're going to see a map there that shows that an overwhelming majority of countries that are fragile or in conflict are among those that are considered the most vulnerable and least ready to adapt to climate change by the NDGAIN index. Now, what you see on this map does not indicate that there is causation between climate change and armed conflict. What it indicates is correlation, in the sense that conflict fragilizes societies in a way that makes them particularly vulnerable to climate risks. So this map does not say climate change causes conflict. It says countries in conflict are particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. Now, despite this acute vulnerability to growing climate risks, people that are enduring conflict or violence are particularly neglected by climate action and finance. And this is because it's riskier to work, it's harder to work in environments that are highly unstable. What we've been saying for now a number of years is we need to be reflecting about what can be done in these environments, in the sense that conflict and instability tend to be long-lasting. We can therefore not wait for peace to be restored to start thinking about how do we strengthen resilience and how do we help people adapt to a changing climate. If we can go to the next slide, please. That takes me to questions of resilience and adaptation. I did want to start by acknowledging that even in stable environments, pathways to effective long-term adaptation are often unclear. And we are starting to see that adaptation initiatives can have maladaptive outcomes, and particularly for marginalized communities. And the example that is very often used is that of building breakwater near a city to protect them from floods, for instance, can lead to surges of water towards farmlands or towards more vulnerable communities. So we do know that adaptation is relatively complicated. Now, what we see is that the challenges of finding the right type of approaches in conflict settings are only exacerbated. What we tried to do is to look at what do we know about approaches that may be effective in conflict environments. And we came up with 5 observations that are common sense to a large extent. The first of them relates to the fact that responses or efforts have to be context specific. They must be grounded in an in-depth understanding of the context. Approaches that are developed in stable environments may be ill-suited to unstable environments. And then when we're looking at a country, we need to understand that a country is not a monolith. So same thing. An approach that might work in the north of the country might not be applicable to the south of the country. And then when we are looking in conflict-affected countries, we also need to bear in mind that levels of development, so access to infrastructure, for instance, will have to be taken into account when we're looking at what type of responses are possible. So that's the context question. Now, in thinking responses in conflict settings, we have to be particularly sensitive to social political dynamics, so we don't end up developing responses that fuel tensions and therefore contribute to the conflict. Responses also need to be informed by an adequate understanding of historical and social political realities that have made certain groups particularly vulnerable. For instance, one can ask, why do certain groups have settled in flood zones, making them vulnerable? And there we need to bear in mind that vulnerability is not simply the result of exposure to climate risks. It's also a question of what makes people more exposed or less exposed, and that we need to understand if we want to be developing the right type of responses. Similarly, when we're looking at climate risks, and that's nearly a factor of humanitarian action, but we tend to be looking at fairly short-term responses. When we're looking at climate risks, we need to be integrating both the short-term dimension, but also the much longer-term dimension into the way we think our responses to ensure that they will help people not only in the short term, but also in the longer run. And then last, we need to be aware of the fact that some of the responses that we may be implementing can help preserving arrangements that may not be positive for communities. And there, for instance, we can think of the fact that in some cases we provide livelihood support to communities to help them stay in place in environments that may be becoming increasingly unlivable. And there we do need to rethink a bit what's the right approach in environments such as this one. Now I'll turn briefly to our role as humanitarian actors in responding to the climate and environment crisis. And for the sake of time, I'll use one example, and that is the example of Eastern Niger. Eastern Niger is enduring a protracted conflict, protracted instability. What we're seeing is that people's safety is not only threatened by the conflict, but also by the fact that there are repeated climate shocks, there are weather variations that are destroying their homes, their infrastructures, that reduce agricultural productivity, that lead to chronic food insecurity, that limit access to water, that cause health issues, and so on. So basically, we have a convergence of risks that are exacerbating people's vulnerability. Now, what we did as the ICRC is I mean, typically you will help people facing a food crisis with food, for instance. But what we know is there's a lean season every year. There's a flood season every year. So we started looking at the chronic nature of the problem and thinking of what type of responses can help us not dealing with the same crisis every year. And therefore will strengthen people's resilience rather than fall every time in the same state of crisis. And there we're piloting a program that is combining adaptations to people's livelihoods, so they're more resilient. They do not lose their harvests every year, for instance. We're helping implementing measures to better manage water, and there we're looking at too much water, not enough water. So how do you use these resources in a way that makes sense and in a way that reduces the risk for communities as well? And then we're working with communities to reduce the instances of certain types of hazards. So for instance, reducing bushfires in selected sites so they're not constantly threatened by significant fires. And that we do in partnership with the communities, with the Red Cross, the Niger Red Cross, and with authorities. I will turn in a second to the fact that while these responses are important, they're not enough. I did want to make a parenthesis before going there, and we can go to the next slide. And it's a parenthesis that pertains to the humanitarian response. I wanted to draw your attention to the Climate and Environment Charter for Humanitarian Organizations, because it's been developed to help us think of our action as humanitarian actors in terms of what should be the ambitions when it comes to the climate and environment crisis. It's been developed jointly by the IFRC, so the International Federation of the Red Cross Red Crescent, and the ICRC with the humanitarian community and for the humanitarian community, based on the recognition that the climate and environment crisis are there, have humanitarian consequences, and we have a responsibility, both in scaling up our response to help people cope with these risks, but also in greening our own responses. Both MSF and IOM have signed the charter along with more than 400 humanitarian organizations and a number of supporters that are states, and that includes Japan. I'm flagging it because it's really an effort to orient, guide, and galvanize the humanitarian response when it comes to the climate and environment crisis. Now, coming back to my Niger example, and we can go to the next slide. Humanitarian responses are important. That's why we work to develop a charter. That's why the ICRC is adapting its response. That's why the likes of MSF are adapting their response and so on. But we also have to be clear that humanitarian responses are not enough. They help people survive in the short term through incremental adaptations, but this leaves significant gaps with regards to both the geography of intervention. We do not work everywhere. We do not have the capacity to work everywhere, but also the depth, the breadth, and the time scale of the efforts to help people adapt. And this is where we've been consistently calling for a much stronger development response, a climate-informed development response in environments that are fragile or in conflict, because that is critical if we want to be looking at adequate climate adaptation in conflict settings. Now we've seen progress. There's been a recognition of the importance of this, and notably at COP28 with the adoption of the Declaration on Climate Relief, Recovery, and Peace that was signed by over 80 states and over 40 organizations. But I would argue that changes are still too slow, and we need to be pushing to turn these changes into reality for people who are at the forefront. And this is the reason, and I'll close on this, but this is the reason for a number of years now, our call has not significantly changed when we are looking at what is it that we are asking both to the humanitarian community, but also to the rest of the world in terms of how should we be improving the response. And we can go to the next slide. And there we are looking at the importance of learning, by documenting and analyzing our actions in terms of what works to strengthen the resilience of people and systems to climate risks in the most unstable environments. We are looking at the importance of collaborating, so pulling our forces together, pulling the expertise of humanitarian development, climate, peace organizations together in order to be able to work at different levels. So from direct support to households, to communities, to systems, and then looking at short and longer timescales. And there I'll make a caveat. We need to do so while preserving space for a principled humanitarian action. And this is where you sometimes have a bit of a tension in terms of how are we managing to work together in a way that is effective. We need to still pay much more attention on prevention of harm, in the sense that a humanitarian response remains relatively reactive and we respond to harm that has been caused. Now, we know that we need to be looking at reducing risks at a structural level and then at a residual level as well. So shocks do not always turn into disasters and people do not end up losing everything. So there we need to rebalance a bit the efforts in terms of where are we investing. And the last point is, at this stage, I think we've all come to an agreement on the fact that we're working with communities that are extremely vulnerable, that are neglected, and therefore we need to be acting. It's urgent, and we had a number of policy discussions to come to a conclusion that this is important. It's really time to turn these discussions into action for the communities we work with. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Catherine Liu. Thank you for introducing the ICRC's recent publication on effective approaches to strengthen people's resilience in conflict settings, and giving us insights of Eastern Niger example, which was enlightening. And also it was indeed interesting to know the details of climate and the environment charter of humanitarian organizations. Also, the ICRC's call for action is very strong, and I think it should work as a wake-up call, to the international community. Thank you. Next, we would like to move on to the presentation of IOM, Mr. Bradley. If you're ready, please take the floor.
Yes, thank you so much. I want to talk about climate change and the potential for humanitarian consequences, but from a different perspective, namely that of migration, and specifically involuntary migration or displacement. I think a few sort of thoughts and reflections from our perspective at IOM in terms of how we sort of understand and view this challenge, and then potentially how we develop solutions to them going forward is worth a few minutes of time. So I'll start, I guess, with a few statistics. In 2022, the last year for which we have complete statistics, and I'm going to talk about this from the perspective of Asia and the Pacific, which is the region that I focus on now. But we see similar trends in other regions as well. Nearly 23 million people were displaced as a result of rapid onset disasters alone in the region, which is more or less consistent with the sort of 10-year average, which shows that 225 million people have had to move, at least temporarily, as a result of, again, rapid onset disasters over the past 10 years. Now, these numbers are high, but I think it's also important and interesting to look at the potential for future migration and displacement as a result of slow onset events, things like sea level rise, desertification, salinization, rising temperatures, etc. Phenomena for which data is more difficult to collect, and which is less visible and I guess less apparent than people who, for example, will move to an IDP camp or an evacuation center for a period of time after a flood or a typhoon. But the data, the statistics that I'll mention now come from a World Bank groundswell report, which many of you may have seen in the past. But what it predicts is that in a worst case scenario, namely that of continued emissions, carbon emissions at the scale that we see them today, plus continuing unequal development pathways, nearly 90 million people in Asia and the Pacific are likely to have to move by 2050. So from our perspective, these sort of regional level numbers or top level numbers in terms of potential future forced migration as a result of either rapid onset disasters or slow onset causes of climate change are of concern. But when we start to unpack, I think, these risks and try to understand them a little bit more, I think the picture becomes a little bit more complicated. So I'll try to raise some of the challenges, I guess, in trying to understand this problem a little bit better, and also to develop solutions. How do we quantify the risk of future climate displacement? I mean, there are some numbers that are presented by various sources, but really it's extremely complex, right? We don't have a great grasp on this question. There certainly isn't a holistic, granular level data or information that would allow for kind of a holistic response, whether we're talking about short-term responses like enhancing preparedness or longer-term responses when we talk about resilience or prevention. There are so many factors that go into understanding both risks that people face, but also, you know, individual or household level decision making when it comes to deciding whether or not an individual or a family will move. When they have to take that decision. I mean, the environmental factors are clear in terms of their ability to drive displacement, but we also understand that those are insufficient to explain this phenomenon. Just because a family lives in a high-risk flood zone does not necessarily mean that they're going to be displaced either over the short term or over the long term. This sort of decision whether or not someone moves, you know, also is based on political factors, economic factors, cultural factors, demographic factors, other factors that are, you know, individual or at family or household level. Climate change itself doesn't necessarily drive displacement. We see it instead as a threat multiplier, quote unquote, making hazards, especially hydrometeorological hazards like floods and storms more frequent and intense, and thereby worsening the disasters that result from them. As the last speaker mentioned, climate change, conflict is driving impacts of climate change, but also in certain cases the reverse is also true, where climate change is also making competition over resources more intense and creating or may have the potential to create instability and eventually conflict and then humanitarian need in the future. I think it's important also to understand the distinction between drivers of displacement and triggers of displacement, right? What makes displacement more or less likely to occur are not necessarily the same reasons that people have to move, right? Drivers of displacement, quote unquote, might be things like slow onset impacts of climate change, such as those that I mentioned earlier, economic instability, demographic changes, urbanization rates, and a variety of other factors that, again, increase or decrease levels of vulnerability and risk. But then the triggers are sort of the immediate cause, I guess, or the proximate cause for which people tend to move. And this is things like food insecurity or water insecurity, loss or disruption to livelihoods, loss of housing or loss of territory, and other factors like that. So when I think we're begin to look at developing responses to some of these questions, whether again it relates to prevention or preparedness, I think there's I think it's essential to look at both the mitigation side, focusing on drivers, as well as adaptation, looking at addressing some of the underlying triggers that lead to displacement. An adverse outcome when it comes to climate change does not necessarily mean that someone is going to move, right? People may choose to stay despite increased risks. Equally, people may be forced to stay, quote unquote, trapped populations, those who probably should move and would like to move, but are unable to do so for a variety of different reasons, economic, political, or others. Also, migration is also a coping strategy in many cases, and will continue to be going into the future. So, it's quite a nuanced, I think, consideration or a set of considerations when we look at what it means when we look at the linkage between climate change and migration. And then when we turn, I think, to the consequences, especially humanitarian consequences, the consequences of climate change, especially as it relates to displacement, are complex, right? And they're not always obvious, especially obvious in the ways that classically we would understand an IDP or an IDP camp. And I'll just mention a few sort of considerations or ways in which this is becoming more complicated, especially urbanization and demographic changes. We see many people moving to the outskirts of cities into informal settlements or slum areas. This is occurring on a large scale in Asia, certainly, but also in other regions. In many cases, people present humanitarian needs in those settings, but they're not first identified as IDPs very easily, number one, and number two, not provided necessarily with the types of assistance that we would classically provide to people who are displaced as a result of a disaster, for example, or conflict. I think a closely related area or issue is a sort of gray area. Who's displaced and who's moving for economic or other reasons? And the line, I think, begins to blur quite considerably between those two categories. I'll just give a very brief anecdote. Where I was working before in the Middle East, we had a number of cases where people were moving as a result of the sort of cascading impacts of climate change. Rural farmers faced challenges in accessing water because the irrigation canals had dried up, backfilled with salt water. They moved to cities where they tried to find employment, were unable to do so. Some continued to move onwards. Others found or joined extremist groups or found presented other issues, right? But when you spoke with them and said, "Why are you here? Basically, are you displaced?" They said, "No, we came for a job." But at the beginning of that chain of events was an involuntary movement, right? But we're not necessarily able to detect or understand these issues, right? But they have humanitarian and other consequences in the future. So we think, better understanding some of the sort of more nuanced ways in which people are forced to move is extremely important. Also from the previous presentation, I mean, this notion of cascading crises, right? Climate change or a disaster leading to economic or political instability, or the reverse, for example, leads to sort of these quite complex and difficult crises to unpack, right? But nevertheless, presenting a humanitarian need and sometimes on a quite large scale. And then the last sort of example I mentioned from that perspective looks at particularly vulnerable groups, right? Whether we're talking about the impact as it relates to gender or age or economic status, etc. Heightened vulnerability makes the likelihood of displacement potentially higher, but also I think we need to look at the sort of differential impacts on those groups if or when displacement occurs. But here again, it's not just a single vulnerability factor, but sort of intersectionality is extremely important to take into consideration when we're looking at potential particular vulnerabilities related to climate change. I'll just wrap up, I think, by a few words on how IOM were coming to view this problem, both in terms of how we frame objectives in our work, as well as how we're beginning to look at measuring potential risk of future climate displacement. I'm conscious of the time, so I'll go through this quite quickly. But essentially, we're looking at this from two perspectives, both in terms of data, how we measure and understand potential impacts, and also sort of programs or approaches to support governments and communities to overcome some of these challenges. I mean, we have people who are likely to need to move in the future. What can be done to identify those groups, but also support them in preventing and better managing their displacement? And this might mean prevention, as I just mentioned, but it also might mean things like planned relocation done in a voluntary way that's respectful of people's rights, but nevertheless serves as a kind of coping mechanism. People who have already moved, especially those living on the outskirts of cities, as I mentioned before, but in other cases as well, who are facing integration challenges, things like lack of access to jobs, social cohesion or tensions, social cohesion issues or intra-community tensions, etc. What can be done more to identify those populations and assist them in overcoming some of these integration challenges? A closely related issue are sort of future locations where people may have to move. Can steps be taken to better identify some of those locations, and also to make them sort of more receptive, both in terms of carrying capacity of those communities, but also programs that can support the people to integrate should they have to move in the future. And finally, all the secondary impacts of climate change, so-called climate security, right? The linkage between macroeconomic impacts, political impacts, and other factors that may result from climate change, but indirectly. but nevertheless leads to displacement. So we finally are working on developing a kind of a risk index that will help us, I think, better understand risks of climate displacement. But I think first in a way that, listen, if what we find is that it's not necessarily likely that people will move, but that in situ solutions are what people will prefer, that's we want to be able to point that out too, because that's also, I think worthy of intervention in certain cases and important to highlight. But we want to be able to sort of underpin stronger prevention and resilience approaches over the longer term, but also preparedness over the shorter term. So over the coming months, we'll begin sort of what we're calling a co-creation approach, where we're bringing together technical experts from all over the region, universities, think tanks, organizations, and other experts who are interested in sort of working with us in developing these sort of risk assessments, this risk index. The reason we're doing it this way is we want to get away from sort of these supply-driven approaches, I guess, where organizations come with something that they develop themselves and isn't necessarily owned or even agreed with, in certain cases, by national actors, national institutions, etc. So there's a lot more to that, obviously, but I do realize that I'm out of time. I probably spoke for more than 8 minutes, so I'll stop there and just to say thank you to the organizers for the invitation to speak here. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bradley. Thank you for sharing the climate challenges which IOM is facing, particularly in Asia Pacific. And well, I could learn like how difficult it is to estimate the future displacement risks. And I'm happy to know that you are working for this risk assessment in collaboration with other stakeholders. Thank you. And now we would like to move on to Ms. Maria Guevara, MSF. Are you ready?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Thank you. Thank you.
Right. Good afternoon, good evening to all. It is an honor to be joining you from MSF International Office here, where I'm based in Geneva. Also, thank you to all the organizers for the invitation. I'm very honored to be speaking with the esteemed colleagues and friends here on the panel. And thank you for the introduction, Mr. Tsudaka. I will do my best to stay within the allotted time. I know we're already slightly over time. As an intro, I just wanted to also reiterate what my other co-panelists have said, that there is no question for humanitarian actors that the effect of climate change, especially on health, is increasingly negative, and its impact will not be only felt by all, but it is today already borne by those most vulnerable disproportionately. We are painfully aware in MSF of those compounding and cascading effect that's been mentioned that climate change has on already existing emergencies, which our teams unfortunately are having to witness on a daily basis. As well highlighted and eloquently articulated by both Catherine Loon and Bradley already, MSF is definitely witnessing those health and humanitarian impacts of climate change and environmental degradation in rather full frontal way. On the next slide, you will recognize the map at the top as similar to the one that Catherine Loon already showed, which is that Notre Dame Global Adaptation Initiative Index of Vulnerability. This one is from 2017. The one below is the map of MSF's activities globally in 2019. So not dissimilar today to today's map, with the exception that we have more areas of coverage, in fact. So as a medical humanitarian organization, we're working in the hardest to reach areas for the most vulnerable and marginalized. Today's climate hotspots are definitely the same as humanitarian hotspots. Unfortunately, they continue to be blind spots for the rest of the world, as well as black holes for investments. So the emergencies we address are in fact the losses and damages faced in real time by the most vulnerable, due to lagging mitigation and adaptation investments and responses. And every single day of inaction means decreasing resilience and increasing emergencies. Not assuming that everyone on the call is familiar with MSF, we are an international independent medical humanitarian organization. We also consider ourselves a private international association. We are made up of mainly doctors and health sector workers, but also of other professions, as logisticians, engineers, administrators, lawyers, etc. While we do not necessarily consider ourselves a rights-based organization, per se, we do speak to human rights, especially to the rights to health. But as an ethics-based organization, we are mainly bounded and guided by our charter and principles, and those are of the medical ethics and humanitarian principles, particularly the principles of neutrality, taking no sides, or impartiality, providing assistance based mainly on the need alone without discrimination, especially for the most vulnerable, and working to ensure access to quality care, and also the principles of independence. We especially value our financial independence, where greater than 95% of our funds are from the generous support of about 7 million individuals like you and me, because this allows us to access communities in the hardest to reach areas, especially in conflict zones, but also to be able to speak truth to power. So we particularly provide assistance to populations in distress, to victims of natural or man-made disasters, and one could argue regarding climate change that everything is now man-made, and to victims of armed conflict. So saving lives, alleviating suffering, promoting or restoring dignity is the core work of MSF's activities, bearing witnesses also to the realities on the ground. So what does that look like in numbers? Next slide, please. So every year, we publish an international activity report with the global numbers that we do publicly. But internally, we look at this in a more in-depth and analytical way to really see what our activities and the impact it has on the field according to what we say we will be doing. So we are working on the 2023 as we speak, but this is from 2022. And what we've seen in 2022 already was this incredible challenge of public crisis situation. We had triple threat of conflict, climate change, and post-COVID, which has led to significant ballooning of our medical operational volume. So pre-COVID, we were running about 800 projects in over 72 countries. Today, or at least in 2022, that ballooned to over 930 projects in over 85 countries, which meant by numbers that our outpatient complications rose by 30% from 2021, 12 million to 16 million. And our inpatient capacities also increased by 20%. Our nutritional emergencies also doubled, especially cases of severe acute malnutrition, tripling in numbers of our ambulatory care, especially noted in Niger, Malaria, Chad, and DRC, or Democratic Republic of Congo, in the Sahel region. Floods affected many, as we heard in 2022, the Pakistan floods, Malawi, Madagascar, and South Sudan were also significantly affected. And disease outbreaks dominated, especially in climate-sensitive diseases, and those related to environmental degradation. We know and still are having to manage multiple cholera outbreaks globally today in over 30 countries, especially in countries that have not seen it for decades. And that in a setting of lack of vaccines, with only one manufacturing company today. We've also seen dengue outbreak nearly reaching pandemic proportions. And for us in Honduras, for example, we've addressed 7 dengue outbreaks since 2010. We're trying to innovate and address that as we speak. Malaria numbers have also doubled to a total of 4.2 million cases just in 2022 alone. So how are we addressing that? Next slide. For MSF, we are considering these triple threat of the 3 C's of conflict, climate change, and COVID through reflection at the planetary crisis level that we're seeing. Because today, the triple crisis of planetary crisis is climate change, pollution, and biodiversity loss. So despite, as you can see, all the different multitude of disciplines that you may frame climate change with health, from MSF's perspective, we're looking at it from the planetary health lens. Next click, please. So it matters because it is a question of responsibility. Click again, please. And the way we're looking at, again, is that it's the importance of looking at it from the planetary health. Next, is that it is important to look at it from a human-centered way, or our responsibility to the ecosystem, highlighting that we are interdependent with the health of planet Earth. We cannot separate the two. Next, and next. It is especially important to highlight that we are part of the cause of this decline in the natural system, which then threatens us and other life forms and becomes a crisis. So it also emphasizes an urgency and need to act now, because our systems are failing. Our broken human systems are not compatible with natural ecosystem of planet Earth. But what's good about planetary health framing is also the need to cross the boundaries and the importance of interdisciplinary work, the building of alliances and developing partnerships across sectors, emphasizing that we cannot address this alone. And how we're doing that, next slide, at MSF, is through 3 action pillars, mainly operational adaptation, but we're also looking at it from our own environmental footprint mitigation angle, and obviously speaking out and advocating climate witnessing. Next slide. What does that look like on operational adaptation? So at MSF, we're working on our adaptive resilience and how to better respond with a short-term as well as long-term sustainable outlook. So trying to be really climate smart in our response, building on our analysis, incorporating the climate-related policies and frameworks, and taking it into consideration the basic inequities, inequalities that are at the heart of why we are here today. And that's already highlighted by Catherine Boone. The assessment and the strong focus on anticipation, anticipatory action are something we're looking at, and the risks that are involved, as mentioned by Bradley. So in MSF, for example, we're looking at these through piloting the use of machine learning, for example, predictive modeling. So here we have an example of a malaria anticipation project, where we take facility data in our antenatal care and our primary healthcare facilities and interlay the data of the meteorological information on that. And what we are seeing is that we can predict even up to 3 months of where malaria outbreak might occur. And so we target that population or that region with seasonal malaria chemo prevention. So we're trying to be smarter in how we do that. We're also looking at climate scenario forecasting, using strategic foresight methodologies to really understand what do we need to invest in today so we can better respond to tomorrow within the short, midterm, and then longer term framing. Next, on footprint mitigation, we are, in keeping with our medical ethics, we're looking at this from a very do no harm principle and taking our social responsibility to organize and manage our own ecological footprint. And we have made a commitment across the movement to halve our carbon emissions by half by 2030 compared to our 2019 levels. As mentioned by Catherine Boone, we have also signed up to the climate charter that's been mentioned to really hold ourselves accountable, not only in the organization, but also to support the push of other humanitarian actors in the sector. We're also looking at waste management closely to see how we can limit the use of single-use plastics, for example, which is a significant challenge in the way clinical practice is run today, is that because there's the balance of the risk of infection and antimicrobial resistance, yet addressing the impact of single use on the environment. Next slide. And finally, on advocacy, we also see our role in speaking out. We do not, per se, it's not about establishing cause and effect, but highlighting the reality is today. So bearing witness, according to our mandate, but also sharing stories and contributing to the data and stories in the public narrative. So we've written and contributed to the Lancet Countdown since 2018. We've attended the COP for the past 5 years, and we've heard that this past COP, COP28, was one of many firsts. We had the Health Day, had the Relief, Recovery, and Peace Day, which was critical in putting the real impacts to the most vulnerable on the table. For next. And for us, this was important because we actually had our international president speak at the Heads of State Forum, which is usually closed to only heads of state and for some invitees. Being able to speak of that is important to shed light to what is really happening on the ground. Our experience in the field and capacity for operational research is also important to add to the data, which is missing horribly at the negotiation tables. There is also a significant gap in the data from the Global South that needs to be captured. As you can imagine, even in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report of the 6th assessment report, there are significant gaps on what diseases are seen actually in the humanitarian hotspots. So we published next on the PLOS on where those gaps are and what we're seeing and what's actually being published. So we have a huge responsibility because we have the opportunity to be in the field, at the bedside, and proximate to those most vulnerable, to the people and communities who are paying the highest price for climate change. It means we have that responsibility to give voice to that reality. This is how we're working at MSF and how we're contributing to the discussions today, and hopefully it will make an impact in the future. I will end there, so thank you. Arigatou gozaimasu.
Thank you very much, Ms. Guevara. And thank you for the in-depth presentation of MSF's operation and the trend you see in the operation. And it was particularly interesting to know some different concepts about health and some researches on climate change impacts on health, which is ongoing. We would like to move on because we are slightly delayed to Ms. Ririko Noda, who is a representative from JYPS. Please, floor is yours.
Thank you for your introduction, Mr. Tsudaka. Are you able to see my screen right now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. Hello, everyone. It is an honor for me to be speaking here today. My name is Ririko Noda. I am a member of the Japan Youth Platform for Sustainability, also known as JYPS, and which is a Japanese youth organization, and I'm a member of the Department of PR. And today I will be talking about how climate change and humanitarian crisis impact the future generation from a youth's point of view. And before we get into the main discussion of climate change and humanitarian crisis, I would like to give a brief introduction of what it means to be a youth. So the word youth has many different definitions and interpretations, but the United Nations Major Group for Children and Youth, or MGCY for short, defines it as individuals under the age of 30. And this group of people actually occupies half of the people on our planet right now. And this is expected to reach 57% by the end of 2030. So from these statistics alone, we can really see the importance of youths in establishing our society, both today and in the future. And this is further shown through the implementations of some programs by the United Nations that aim to increase the political involvement of young people, such as the Youth 2030, which is the UN Youth Strategy that was created in 2018, as well as the establishment of the UN Youth Office in 2023. And next, I will be moving on to the impact of climate change and humanitarian crisis on youths. As other panelists have highlighted, the two issues are very intricately and intimately connected, and I would like to particularly highlight their impact on youths, especially young children. Predominantly, out of the forcibly displaced people in the world, 40% of them are children below 18 years of age. And between 2016 and 2021, there were 43.1 million child displacements caused by weather-related disasters. These data really corroborate the fact that children are heavily impacted by climate change and humanitarian crisis. Now I will be discussing further why this issue especially impacts the youth. And the first and foremost reason is that children are the most vulnerable to the side effects of climate change. And this reason can be boiled down to two main factors, the first being the impact on their physical well-being, and the second is being the socioeconomic factors. Firstly, for the physical well-being, climate change induces many different issues, including air pollution and global warming, which leads to the spread of viruses and diseases that may not have occurred in the past. Global warming also leads to issues of crop failures, leading to inadequate sustenance and therefore malnutrition. And there's also the issue of lack of access to healthcare, especially in areas that are in need of humanitarian aid. So these factors all contribute to the disruption of children's physical well-being in their crucial years of development, especially since they do not have a strong immune system compared to adults. And next is the socioeconomic factors that are caused by climate change. And the first is the disruption of education. This mainly refers to areas of asylum or protection shelters after natural disasters where children are unable to continue their schooling and therefore they are unable to access adequate education. And there's also the issue of economic vulnerability of children, since when their houses or their living conditions have been destroyed by natural disasters, for example, that was caused by climate change, it is very likely for them to fall into impoverishment due to their lack of financial independence. And the second reason as to why this issue especially impacts the youth is that climate change and humanitarian crisis is a generational problem. So here I specifically looked at climate change, and the two graphs show the progression in world population and carbon dioxide emission from the year 1750 to 2015. And we can see that the two graphs look almost identical in its shape, which suggests that the increase in world population also leads to an increase in CO2 emission. And it is in fact predicted that there will be 2 billion more people on this earth by 2050. Therefore, the further increase in world population is likely to exacerbate the progression of climate change. And thus, the future generations will be the ones responsible for tackling this issue in the future. And now I will be moving on to how youths can actually take actions to combat the issues that I've discussed. And the first thing that we can all do is to raise awareness and propel youth empowerment. Some examples include disseminating information as well as educating ourselves on these social issues, and also attending or hosting events that aim to raise awareness. And I believe that this is especially important for youths in Japan, since we live in a first world country, and although many people may be interested or are knowledgeable of the issues happening in the world, many people may lack the sense of responsibility or the sense of urgency to take first-hand actions to solve global issues that are happening outside of Japan. So here I've listed some strengths of youth activism, which include our access to wide information as digital natives. A lot of us are familiar with social media, as well as our open-mindedness and flexibility in accepting new values, and also the fact that generally a lot of youths are future-oriented perspective holders. And the second way of how youths can take actions is through demanding actions from decision-making parties, such as the government or international institutions. And some examples of this may include demanding those institutions to increase investment in tackling climate change, such as investment in clean energy, or demanding to invest in mitigation and adaptation efforts to combat natural disasters. And as a member of JYPS myself, a platform where the voices of Japanese youths are consolidated and delivered as policy proposals, I believe in the importance of political advocacy and political participation of the youths. And last year, we created an SDGs Youth Proposal 2023 based on the 5 Ps of the SDGs listed here, which are people, planet, prosperity, peace, and partnerships. And we garnered the voices of Japanese youths by conducting online events and surveys, and we delivered its culmination as a policy proposal to the Japanese government. So we believe that the opinions of the youths need to be cherished and reflected in political decision-making processes, and therefore demanding actions from decision-making parties is one of the ways that we can tackle social and global issues. I would like to conclude this presentation by restating that active youth participation is indispensable in tackling the climate and humanitarian crisis, and that we can all work together cross-generationally to overcome climate change and humanitarian crisis for both the current and the future generation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Ririko. Yeah, it was interesting to know the youth point of view on the impacts of climate change and humanitarian crisis, and I could see really like a strong logic behind the youth opinion. And I found that in order not to make youth generation victim of climate change, I think it is important to not only hear youth voice, but also, you know, involve them in our discussion and take action based on your demand. Yeah, thank you very much. And now we move on to interactive discussion among the panelists and also including the audience. For the audience, if you have any question, please use the chat box, and well, you can use both English and Japanese, and then the secretariat will take care of translation. So feel free to put your questions. So while the audience is doing that, I would like to cast some questions based on your presentation, and I'd like to start with a question to Ms. Catherine Loon, because you mentioned about this climate and the environment charter for humanitarian organizations. I think it was a brilliant idea. And well, we understand that the charter sets commitments voluntarily by humanitarian organizations. And what would be the next step? Because I'm sure, you know, this initiative was established like a few years back. And do you plan to do a stock take or monitoring, or could you elaborate a little bit more on the mandate of the Secretariat, which is to be set up?
Absolutely. So we had the charter open for signature in 2021. In the charter itself, organizations commit to establishing targets and implementation plans at the latest 1 year after signing. And we realized quite early on that few organizations were submitting their targets and implementation plan. So we surveyed signatories to ask what's preventing you from submitting targets and implementation plans. We assume you're planning to translate the charter into practice. So what are the obstacles? The response that came back was very much, we need hands-on support to be able to know how to, for instance, Maria was alluding to the fact that MSF is committed to reducing its carbon emissions by 50% by 2030. To be able to make such a commitment, you first need to be able to calculate your emissions. We can, as the ICRC, calculate our emissions. MSF can, but that actually requires tools, technical expertise, and so on and so forth. So we actually realized that a number of tools were required for signatories and then support to be able to take proper commitments that they would be able to monitor and implement. So that was a part of the feedback. The other piece of the feedback was we'd like to be able to reflect with peers on what is it that they're testing and adapting and so on and so forth. So what we're doing now is setting up a secretariat. 2 people have been appointed. All signatories will be receiving an email in a week or 2 saying, these are the 2 people who are now running the secretariat. with 4 main tasks. One of them is acting as a referral center. So say you're an NGO in South Sudan and you want to understand what you need to integrate to your WASH program, who can you turn to? So the role of the Secretariat there will be to connect with the right providers of expertise. So referral center, helping convening these conversations among experts to understand how do we need to be adapting programs. So very likely at the sub-regional or national level, but so we start having conversations, and then questions of knowledge management, and then continuing to promote an adaptation of the response of the sector. Now to your response on, is there going to be some sort of a stock take? One thing we didn't want to do is to end up having to monitor what everyone is doing, because this is not reasonable. We're not going to start policing the sector. So it's much more, it's a voluntary mechanism. So the expectation is that organizations are reporting back. Now what we do have is on the Climate Charter webpage is the commitments taken by organizations. And that's already, we're starting to have enough. We have about 10 to 15% of the 400 signatories that have submitted their targets. So we're starting to have enough to be able to get a picture of what type of commitments are organizations taking in terms of, not commitments, but what are the plans of organizations when it comes to their translation of the charter into practice. So that part of the stock take we're able to do.
I see. I think, yeah, it is very interesting to visit this website. Well, actually, I did, but it's good to regularly check, the updates of the charter website, yeah, which can be quite a good monitoring already to the humanitarian organizations. Okay, I have a question to Ms. Wait. Sorry, I'd like to have, okay, a question to Mr. Bradley. Because you mentioned about many things, well, migration due to sudden onset or and slow onset, and those are quite complicated mechanisms behind that I understood. But as a kind of result of these onsets, well, we can choose like evacuation and displacement and relocation and migration, and there are so many options for actually people to move. And I'm interested to know like how IOM is trying to form these options for climate-induced migrants on the ground, as each member of community has various or different voices or opinions, and it must be very difficult, to decide which option is suitable for a community. So how do you arrange that?
Thank you so much for the question. I mean, I think the first and most important point is it's not our choice, right? It's the principle of voluntariness is fundamental, is paramount, right? So these decisions are should be taken by potential migrants or displaced persons themselves on a fully informed basis, and any sort of voluntary movement that they undertake should be done in full dignity, with full information available, and in full respect of their rights, right? But at the same time, it's important that they're aware of risks and hazards that they may face in their location, as well as what might be available in alternative locations. It's governments in Asia and the Pacific are increasingly looking to planned relocation as a potential policy solution for people who face long-term hazards, which may or may not be able to be easily mitigated. This presents a series of issues. For example, one is are those decisions about who will go being taken purely on the basis of need, in the sense that are people being asked to move or given the opportunity to move because they must do so, or for extraneous or other political and economic reasons. This is a key consideration. Also, where are they going, right? What land is made available for people to relocate to in the future? I know that in Japan you have experience with relocations as well, but done in a very structured and organized way. This isn't always the case in some other countries. People end up sometimes on land that is even more vulnerable to natural hazards, flood prone, or otherwise. And I think this was mentioned in one of the other presentations. Access to livelihoods very far in certain cases from livelihood opportunities, from educational opportunities, etc. So I think, as it relates to migration as a potential solution, there's promise there. I think governments are increasingly looking to this, but this needs to be done, I think, very carefully and only under the right circumstances. You mentioned evacuation as an option. I think this is a short-term measure in cyclone-prone or typhoon-prone countries, for example. It's a very common practice, and without being sort of overly reductionist, I mean, we look at this as sort of good displacement in the sense that people are using migration and using displacement as a coping mechanism, as a life-saving measure itself, right? So if people are supported to evacuate, generally by government, sometimes by the military or by police, etc., in dignified conditions for a short period of time where services are available and people are safe. This is an excellent life-saving measure. But that doesn't necessarily mean, or that doesn't mean that their house or their livelihood is safe. They may go to the evacuation center to save their life, to avoid physical harm to themselves, but may nevertheless face significant challenges after the event passes, related to housing, related to livelihoods, access to services, for example, and other factors. So, yeah, I mean, migration, I think, and displacement, even in certain cases, is both a problem, and in other ways, it can be seen as a coping mechanism or a solution. But this, in either case, it needs to be, I think, carefully considered, structured well, and be respectful of people's rights and voluntariness at all times.
I see. Thank you very much for your answer. And next, I would like to have a question for Ms. Maria. Well, according to the presentation, it is important to make mitigation effort of climate change because humanitarian organizations cannot be a cause of harm to the community. But at the same time, adaptation effort is essential because community of the beneficiaries need to be resilient to the climate shocks. That I understand, and both are important. But that actually applies to other health institutions, like national health institutions, right? And do your organization advocate for other health institutions on the ground? And what kind of response do you get?
Sure. I mean, I think first important to understand that our main interlocutor on the ground, wherever we are, is the Ministry of Health themselves. And we work really, really closely in how to support the healthcare system. In some cases, in some of the countries that we work in, those healthcare systems are already weakened because of conflict or for whatever reason. So where there is somewhat functioning healthcare system, we're starting, especially from the climate lens terms, we're trying to see how we can work together in trying to be climate smart. So working with different data sets, for example, to target the most vulnerable populations that may be affected by climate sensitive diseases. As I gave an example, we're looking at in Madagascar, for example, we're working with Chris Golden, who's working from Harvard, who's been working with the Ministry of Health, because there's huge data gaps actually on how do we get those together and complement what is existing with the Ministry of Health, especially at the community level for those who don't come in. So we're trying to help bridge those to see where those vulnerabilities really are, because they may be affected and they're dying there where we're not reaching them. But also when we're speaking on advocacy, the big impacts on whether it's the national determined contributions or the national adaptation plans, the health systems are usually falling out and don't have the same capacity or analysis, and we're trying to make that bridge for them and how we can support them in either mitigating their healthcare system and working with the likes of Healthcare Without Harm, who has a huge, extensive global network on getting supporting the health systems on what does it mean to mitigate and what kind of structures can be put in place. We're working with the actors like Climate Action Accelerator, who works with NGOs like us to really work on the road mapping on, because that data that Catherine Lin was saying is not obvious on how to collect them, especially when you're an organization as large as we are, and we have different data collection points and different ways of collecting that data. But it's really important. So we're trying to share our experience with that. So they're targeting small hospitals as well, but also on the adaptation, because those are mitigation can be an adaptation element, but and vice versa. So trying to see how we can support on all those fronts. Innovation is very key on what kind of technology we can use, machine learning on being smarter and how we predict the way forward. And then joining hands on scenario planning, especially with a climate lens. What does the future scenario look like together? And we're trying to build those bridges for the different healthcare system.
Thank you very much for your answer. And I'd like to cast a question to Ms. Ririko, but this is actually a question for you to ask questions to other speakers, because I'm still waiting for other audience to cast some other questions. But I mean, you listen to all these presentations from front runners of humanitarian organizations, and it was quite enriching for sure. So by listening to their voices, how did you think as a youth? And if you have any question for these practitioners, please do so.
Thank you. Yeah, I personally was able to learn a lot from these speakers, since as a youth, there's definitely this lack of firsthand experience of working in areas that are in desperate need of humanitarian crisis. And although we youths can do a lot in terms of accessing information, gathering information, as well as disseminating information, there's also this lack of experience, lack of expertise, and I guess lack of specialization in those areas. So some questions I would like to ask the panelists is perhaps what we youths can, I guess, do to raise awareness among the younger generation, since that's something that even me as a youth personally has been looking for answers to. So I would like to hear from the panelists if possible.
All right, maybe Ms. Catherine Noon, do you want to go first?
Sure. I'm smiling because we look up to you in how you've been able to mobilize the youth. I mean, to me, the mobilization that has happened in the younger generation has been amazing, and has actually managed to place the topic on the agenda in a way that had not been highly successful. So I would actually say that on that front, we should be learning from you and not the other way around, because I mean, it's very much thanks. You've had scientists, you've had the COPs going on, you've had a number of people pushing for a greater recognition of the crisis. And then suddenly you had a huge youth mobilization that I think really tipped the public conversation. So I would actually say we need to learn from you. We are, I think, struggling. I mean, Maria and I have been discussing quite often of how it can even be hard to mobilize our own organizations, and relying on the importance of integrating these dimensions to our work. And one thing that has helped us in that journey is the pressure coming from the outside. The younger generation in our own organization is also pushing and saying, this is highly relevant. You cannot neglect the impacts of climate change and environmental degradation on the communities we work with. So I think you've played a remarkable role in forcing us all to be mobilized. So I would say continue doing so, and continue flagging the impacts, and continue being mobilized and committed, because it does make a tremendous difference.
Thank you. Maybe Mr. Bradley?
Yes, no, I agree completely with Catherine Noon. find a diplomatic way to say this, but sometimes our organizations, and as we get older, there's a tendency, I think, to fall into I guess norms that are established by the organizations, to adhere to what the limitations of what we hear from organizations, from politicians, from institutions, all of these things. And some of these are there for good reasons, and other times they're not, right? But I mean, I guess we can benefit, all of us, and I think even come to rely upon the push that can come from youth mobilization, from mobilization of the population in general. So what I would say is, I mean, both in terms of mobilizing yourselves for your role as leaders in the future, but also as a way to keep us, those a generation ahead of you, I guess, working in the right direction and representing your interests. I would just say keep pushing, right? Because this is key. Keep the pressure up. It has results, and it's super important.
Thank you, Ms. Maria.
Yeah, so thank you for the question, Judiko. Yeah, so first, the youth, you guys are much smarter than we are. We were, as Catherine was saying, we're quite fossilized, just for the I'm just kidding. But no, I'm not really. But actually, we're quite, it's harder to change habits. And I think the youth, you are much more flexible, and this flexibility is important. You're also agile in the new technologies, and the innovation around that is going to be important. We work a lot at MSF with the International Federation of the Medical Students Association, and that youth and the education system needs to be where the awareness also is implemented, and you should be asking for that in your education systems. I was just in the Planetary Health Alliance annual meeting in Malaysia, and I've just come back to that, where there's a huge push on how do we integrate it, that awareness up, down, and across. And the youth voice, there was always somebody from the youth groups in the panel. So thank you, whoever organized that we have a youth voice here. And I think in every panel we should have one, to remind us that our old systems are not working, and to give us a new push for different ideas. So as what has already been said is, to not be dismayed, be pushing us, because we need to be reminded of because the future is in your hands. You will be the one managing that. The question is, how can we support that and ensure that you don't fall into eco-anxiety, mental health problems that in awaiting for this unfortunate future crisis. So hopefully we can help mitigate that for you. So just reminding us of that responsibility we have is already good. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm happy that this discussion is getting more and more interactive, and we received some questions from the audience as well. So I'd like to share maybe this. The first question is, how can technology and scientific knowledge in climate change be used for humanitarian assistance? So these are for the practitioners. I think Ms. Maria already talked about lots of innovative means of operations. So I'd like to give this question to Ms. Catherine first, and Mr. Bradley next.
I can be fairly short. I'll give two quick examples.
Sure.
Scientific knowledge is useful in understanding longer-term projections and impact, and that needs to feed into the way we think our responses. The ICRC does quite a lot of water-related work, so we build water infrastructure, for instance. There we need to understand how water tables are evolving, so we don't over-extract and don't contribute to water scarcity in the future, and their science is critical. This is also true when we do some agricultural work, which we do quite a lot with communities. We are looking at what type of seeds might still be good to use in environments where rains are less predictable, for instance, and their science, again, is incredibly useful. We commonly work with universities and researchers to adapt responses, and this can be climate experts, but it can also be other lines of expertise. I mean, hydrological engineers helping us doing some interpretation of data. But I would say a good climate response needs to be science and technology informed. Otherwise, we are going to be failing there.
Sure, thank you. Mr. Bradley?
Sure. Yeah, I'll just make a couple of points also. I mean, I think we've seen over the past couple of decades, 10, 20 years, you know, first how the internet, mobile phones, apps, these sorts of things have come to change the way humanitarian assistance is delivered, the way needs are assessed, the way beneficiaries are identified, etc. I think that sort of trend will continue into the future. I mean, you know, the potential for making humanitarian assistance more effective, avoiding missing people, avoiding people slipping through the cracks, making humanitarian assistance faster, more responsive, and more accountable, I think is the potential exists, especially, you know, through the utilization of advanced technologies, advanced communication technologies, etc. And I think a related point, and this goes back to my presentation earlier, is how we're able to use science and technology, especially as it relates to data, to better understand the future impacts of climate change, including those which relates to population movements. This relates to using machine learning for analysis of big data sets, whether this is, you know, anonymized mobile phone records, social media information, remote sensing, and plenty of other data sets that we can, you know, start to derive understanding and meaning in ways that we couldn't even just a few years ago. I mean, that's just one, I think, of many examples of ways in which rapidly changing technologies and scientific understanding can improve humanitarian assistance. But then also, I mean, broader than just humanitarian assistance, I think we're also beginning to see ways in which AI, especially in machine learning, but other technologies are useful in terms of climate change mitigation. So looking at some of the ways in reducing carbon emissions. I read something recently about development of enzymes that can consume plastics, for example. I mean, there's plenty of interesting research and initiatives that are coming online. At the same time, and this will be my last point, I think we also need to be quite careful, right? I mean, sometimes with the cutting edge technologies, there are unintended consequences, unforeseeable consequences that may arise in the future. So I think, you know, with great promise also comes risk. So I think prudence and being careful is very important.
Thank you, Mr. Bradley. Okay, the second question from the audience goes to Ms. Maria, maybe. Could you share your experience or good practice of integrating climate resilience into immediate action in conflict-affected areas? It seems challenging, but crucial. Any example of how local communities is engaged and motivated to mitigate environmental damage from conflicts?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I think, you know, in a lot of the places that I had just mentioned in my presentation, that compounding effect of conflict with climate, and you see a lot of this in South Sudan. And so in the middle of a conflict-stricken area, you will have significant flooding. And I think while science and technology is useful to predict and at least to model and where things might be happening, even in, you know, the meteorological anticipation project that we have to understand where floods might be hitting, especially if they're conflict-affected areas, it's when you actually want to go back to basics, right? So we know that there's already a challenge for the most vulnerable women and children to access the facilities in conflict-affected areas. When that area is flooded, it's even worse. So while they may be welcome, so pre-positioning, for example, letting the communities know how to anticipate, how to read. They have a network of their own on when floods might happen. I mean, how do we reinforce that? For example, in Sudan, there's a network of their own contacts and families that may be somewhere up the river of the Nile will say when the river is this high upstream, that it will certainly cause flooding where they are. So just igniting that kind of network and enforcing that, but then giving them elements and what they need to do to prepare for it. So again, just helping them have canoes so the pregnant woman can at least be able to have access to the facilities in that setting. So preparing the communities and working with the communities directly and not always, and mixing new with old technologies to see how we can better prepare them. And in an unfortunate situation of conflict, everything gets destroyed. So the resilience elements and mitigating element, and you put all these, it's really difficult. And what we're trying to say is, how do we do this in the most frugal way so we don't create more damage?
Thank you very much for your answer. The time is ticking, and I really need to wrap up. But I just would like to give a floor to Ms. Ririko for final remarks, just 30 seconds, just to wrap up.
So to wrap up my main points that I've wanted to emphasize, I think the issue of climate change and humanitarian crisis is something that the planet is facing currently, and that it's also something that needs to be tackled immediately in order to mitigate its future damages and the exacerbation in the future. So I think it's very important, not just for the youths, but also cross-generationally for all generations to work together to mitigate and really tackle the root causes of these issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ririko-san. I totally agree. I mean, well, the issue of climate change and humanitarian issues is not only important for younger generations, but also our generations as well. So yeah, we need to tackle both together. Thank you very much for joining from Geneva, from Bangkok, and from Tokyo. And thank you very much for the audience to join this important discussion. And I hope you enjoyed. So I wrap up here. And this Humanitarian Congress Tokyo is going to be closed by the closing remarks from the ICRC representatives. So I'll give the floor to her. Thank you very much, everybody.
人道援助コングレス東京2024にご参加いただきました皆様、どうもありがとうございました。今年も3日間にわたり700人以上の方々に登録いただき、活発な議論がなされたことを大変嬉しく思います。今年は人道援助の危機に立ち向かうというテーマのもと、人道援助そのものが存続の危機にさらされている現状について理解を深めるとともに、事態打開に向けた行動を考えることを目的として活発な議論が展開されました。オープニングセッションでは人道援助の危機について問題提起がなされ、パネリストが各々の専門的な立場から意見を交換しました。新しい技術の出現などにより人道援助自体が複雑化している一方、従前から言われている通り、政治的解決なしに人道的解決はないこと、現在の社会にはさまざまな観点で分断が生じており、異なる意見を持つアクターと世代を超えて議論をしていくことがますます必要であること、日本に何を求めるのかという大きな問いに対して、日本が世界で培ってきた信頼や実績を最大限に活用し、国際社会でのリーダーシップを発揮することなどについて提言がありました。性暴力に関するセッションでは、世界のどこでも起こりうる性暴力について、さまざまな視点からディスカッションが行われました。紛争の武器として使われる性暴力、児童婚と若年性妊娠、また国境なき医師団の取り組む安全な中絶の課題、さらに男性や男児の性被害の現状や加害者支援について各専門家から発表がありました。加えて、未来の性暴力の撲滅のため、学生含む登壇者より、性教育や制度改革の重要性が指摘されました。ビジネスと人権問題のセッションでは、コンゴ民主共和国の問題に焦点を当てましたが、この課題は他の紛争地にも当てはまります。鉱物取引に関する規範を作ることで、鉱物取引により影響を受ける人々に ポジティブなインパクトがあった一方で、新たな問題が作られたのも事実であることが分かりました。多くの民間企業はコンプライアンスに焦点を置く傾向にありますが、さらに一歩踏み込んだ人権デューデリジェンスの必要性が再認識されました。スーダンのセッションでは、昨年の紛争勃発以降、国軍と RSF だけではなく、乱立する武装勢力による戦闘が各地でエスカレートしている状況が報告されました。紛争によって多くの医療施設が破壊され、IDP や難民に対する高い保健医療ニーズがある一方、ビザや物資搬入のための許可が得られず、人道アクセスが制限され、人道援助、人道支援機関が全く足りていない状況が続いています。周辺国の思惑も巻き込み、紛争は長期化の様相を呈していますが、多数のスーダン市民は紛争の終結を望んでいます。世界で多くの危機が発生する中、今回のセッションが多くの方々にスーダンに関心を寄せ続けるきっかけになればと思います。気候危機が現実となっている中開かれた気候変動と人道危機のセッションでは、紛争や暴力に直面する国特有の課題、気候変動により移動を余儀なくされる人々の現状と、将来的な移動のリスクを測ることの難しさ、気候変動が及ぼす保健医療や若者への影響について各専門家から発表がありました。課題を克服していくためのさまざまな方策が提案されましたが、共通していることは協働すること、連携することの重要性、そして若者が果たしてきた役割への高い評価と、今後果たしていく役割への期待でした。加えて、私たち人道支援組織が気候変動に組織全体として取り組むことへのコミットメントを表明し、実現するための一つの方法である気候環境検証が紹介されました。3日にわたる5つのセッションを通して、さまざまな角度から今ここにある人道援助の危機を見つめてきました。では、私たちに何ができるのかという問いに対する答えは、実は比較的シンプルで、私たち一人一人が世界で起きていることに関心を持ち続け、正しい情報を入手し、関心の輪を広げていくことに尽きると思います。また、国内外を問わず、最も弱い立場にある人々を保護し、支援を届けるために日々尽力するすべての人道支援従事者が職務を全うできるよう、それぞれのアクターが法や原則を守ることが極めて重要であることもご理解いただけたのではないでしょうか。この場をお借りしてご参加いただきました皆様に改めて心からの感謝を申し上げます。質疑等を通して人道援助コングレスへ積極的に参加していただいたおかげで、より充実した興味深い意見交換を行うことができました。最後に、人道援助コングレス東京2024の開催にご協力くださった方々、特にアドバイザリーグループのメンバーに感謝を表明するとともに、来年の第6回人道援助コングレス東京で皆様に再びお目にかかることを心から楽しみにしております。どうもありがとうございました。